Hi everybody, Dr. Mike here. So this is our second online tutorial for our online version for 1805 NRS now. We had the first one at 10 a.m. this morning. This is the second one at 2 p.m. We will be reiterating concepts and content that we went through at 10 a.m. But I'm also going to answer questions from the live chat. So if there's any specific topics or concepts that you'd like me to work through, please pop it on the chat. I can have a quick read and then we can get to it. So a bit of housekeeping to begin with. The first thing we need to talk about is the fact that we no longer have a mid-trimester exam. We now have a written exam. So I've uploaded a tutorial for you to watch. I've uploaded the topics. So if your surname begins with A to M, your topic is the heart. If your surname begins with N to Z, your topic is the respiratory tract. And with the respiratory tract, you can choose anywhere along that respiratory tract. So it could be the trachea, or the bronchi, or the bronchioles, or the lung tissue itself. It's entirely up to you. I've also put out the marking criteria for all that topics as well. And what I need you to do is go into the assessment tab of the Learning at Griffith page and review all the written assignment information that's there. Any questions, please send me an email. I'll be able to give you a hand. With these tutorials, what I want to do is figure out a way to best support you and provide you with information that helps supplement your learning. So obviously the fact it's not face-to-face means it's less dynamic. However, the fact that I can get your information here live and answer your questions will be brilliant. If there's any problem with my sound quality or the visual quality, please just let me know. What we're going to work through in today's tutorial will be last week's content, which is lecture 4, which is tissues and integumentary system, and this week's content, which is lecture 5, the skeletal system. The first thing I'd like to begin with is when we look at lecture 4, tissues and integumentary, we need to first focus on tissues. So when we look at tissues, a couple of things. We already know from the way we've built this course so far, we have atoms, we have elements and ions. They're the smallest things we basically work with, right? We have atoms that come together to form molecules. These molecules form together to form bigger structures, macromolecules, right? Proteins, fats, carbs, and so forth. These macromolecules come together to form organelles. These are small structures within a cell. So organelles come together to form a cell. And then cells come together to form a tissue, which is what we're talking about here. And then tissues come together to form an organ or organ system. And then organ systems come together to form an organism, you or I, all right? Now when we look, so we've already built our way up to tissues now, and there's 4 different tissue types you must know. So these are the 4 different tissue types. You need to know connective tissue. You need to know epithelial tissue. You need to know nervous tissue. And you need to know muscle tissue. Now, what do these things do? So very quickly, what they do is connective tissue wraps and protects. Sometimes I say binds and protects. Epithelia lines hollow organs, but also forms barriers. Nervous tissue sends messages via neurons. And muscle tissue, well, what muscle tissue does is it does work. That's the term that we use. It does work, but it moves things, right? It moves our skeleton. It moves substances inside hollow tubes, like our gut, for example. But it also tells blood vessels to constrict and dilate, and it tells our muscle to contract to pump blood. It tells our heart to contract to pump blood. Now, these are the 4 different tissue types. Nervous and muscle we're not going to focus on today or this week, because next week we're going through the nervous tissue, and then the subsequent weeks we're going through muscle tissue. So let's wipe these 2 off and let's focus on connective tissue and epithelial tissue. Now there's heaps of different, let's first focus on connective. There's heaps of different types of connective tissue. What do you need to know? You need to know these particular points is that connective tissue is made up of 3 things. It's made up of cells, gels, and fibers. Now this is what I focused on in the lecture on my YouTube video, so I'll just be very brief. There's different types of connective tissue, right? So for example, Bone is connective tissue. Blood is connective tissue. Lymph is connective tissue. There's something called connective tissue proper, and that's made up of dense connective tissue and loose connective tissue. And this can include things like adipose or fat. All these things are connective tissue, but they're pretty different from one another, right? So you've got bone, which is hard, and blood, which is a fluid. So compare bone to blood. Oh, another thing that's connective tissue is cartilage, right? Something we're going to talk about today. But bone and blood, both connective tissue, but very different. One's very solid, one's fluid. So what makes connective tissue? Well, it has to do with these cells, gels, and fibers. Now, the cells vary from one to another. So bone will have its own specific bone cells, which we'll talk about. Blood cells, lymph cells, and so forth. The gels is like a jelly. I like to think of the gels as a jelly. If you're making jelly at home, it's basically water with a bit more substance to it, okay? It's something that can be easily broken apart, but you can embed things in it. And the things that you can embed are the fibers, and there's 3 different types of fibers. There's collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Now, the cells vary. The gels are very similar between one another, and it's like a jelly. But then what makes something hard or fluid or whatever it may be, or squishy or whatever, is the fibers embedded in the gels. That's what's important. And so when we look at bone, you have a lot of collagen tissue, right? When you look at something like cartilage, you've got collagen tissue, but you've also got elastic tissue, because cartilage isn't as hard as bone, for example. So this is what happens. So think about some jelly that you put rubber bands in, or you put steel metal rods in. It changes the way it moves, its dynamics. This is what you need to know. All right, the next thing we need to talk about is that because of your assignment, as an example, right? Because of your assignment, you need to know about the 4 tissue types within the organs or structures that you're referring to. So if you have the heart, for example, you need to talk about the connective tissue that's at the heart. Is it areola or loose connective tissue? Is it dense connective tissue? Is it cartilage? Is it bone? What type of connective tissue is there? And why is it there? What is its function? We know connective tissue's overall function is to wrap things and protect things. So I assume it has something to do with that. So you just need to do your research. Same thing when it comes to the respiratory tract, all right? So that's connective tissue. When we look at epithelial tissue, let's see if there's any questions at the moment. In my past class, we went through all the layers of the dermis. I thought we didn't need to know that this year. Sorry, this is from last week's content. I'll talk about that in 1 second. Talk about that when we go through the integumentary system in a sec. When we look at epithelia, what you must remember is form equals function. All right, what does this mean? So, epithelia can come in a number of different forms, right? So, for example, epithelial cells can be squished like that. Epithelial cells can look like cubes. Epithelial cells can look like columns. And that's their actual name. This one is called squamous, meaning squished. Cuboidal, shaped like a cube. And columnar, shaped like a column. Easy. So that's their structure, right? As individual, what we call epithelial cells. But they can then be arranged in different ways. So for example, if you have a single layer, one layer of epithelial cells, it's called simple. If you have 2 or more layers, it's called stratified. So for example, squamous is squished, cuboidal shaped like a cube, columnar shaped like a column. Something to talk about first here. Why? Why are they like this? All right, think of why we have cells. We have cells because they're little cities. Inside these cities, we have factories and post offices and libraries and things that allow for the city to work. If it's squished, is there going to be much room inside to have all these organelles or intracellular compartments? The answer is no. Squamous cells don't do much because they don't have anything really inside to let them do anything. So they're not producing anything like acidic. They're not producing anything, and they're probably not going to take something in to use. So why do we have squamous cells? Well, let's get back to that in a sec. Now, cuboidal cells, they're bigger. They have more intracellular compartments and components and organelles, so they do produce things. So cuboidal cells are likely going to release things from the inside and probably take things in from the outside. And the same thing happens with the columnar cells. They're likely going to release things that they've made and take things in to be used. Right. Now, when we look at the layers, let's just start with squamous, for example. If I had one layer of squamous cells, you would call this simple, because it's one layer, squamous. So this is called simple squamous. Easy. But that is just describing its form. But form equals function. So knowing that it's simple squamous should tell you what it does. I told you, it's not going to produce anything to be released. That's not happening. It's not going to take anything in because what's it going to do with it? There's no components inside to use anything. So simple squamous cells are there to let things pass through. So simple squamous, wherever you find areas that have simple squamous, it's there for things like diffusion. Simple squamous. The form tells you the function. It makes sense. It's not there to protect anything. You'll easily be able to break through a simple squamous barrier. It's not there to produce anything because it can't. Does that make sense? Hopefully that all makes sense. Now, let's talk about the other ones, for example. See if there's any questions so far. Do we need to know the in-depth information on cranial, vertebral column, thorax, and upper lower extremity bones? If you go onto the Learning at Griffith page, you will see that we have a bones list. All right, so if you go into the tutorial notes, there is something called a bones list. They're all the bones you need to know of the body that I will assess you on in an exam format. Okay, bones of the body, the bones list. Access that. All right, cuboidal. You can have a simple cuboidal layer, or you can have a simple columnar layer, for example. You can even have, let's wipe this off, you can even have, for example, let's move on from simple layers, let's look at stratified. What if we had many squamous layers like this? I want you to think about it. Form equals function. Firstly, it's called stratified squamous. That's pretty easy. But why is it there? Is it there to let things diffuse through? Well, no, there's too many layers, so it's obviously not there to let things diffuse through. Many layers of basically dead cells because there's nothing inside. So what is it here for? It's here for protection. It's to stop us. Stratified squamous cells are in places, right? Are in places to protect us. So think about it. Epithelia lines cavities. It lines hollow structures. So for example, epithelia lines all of your skin. When you look at me, you're looking at my epithelia. Inside your mouth, epithelia. Down your esophagus, epithelia. Inside all of your tubes, epithelia. It's going to be the layer that's most intimately associated with the hollow inside of tubes. That's epithelia. But it depends on what that tube does or what that hollow structure or organ does. So when we look at skin, it's going to be stratified squamous to protect us. If it's in our mouth, stratified squamous because we're going to chew food. We don't want to damage our face. We don't want to destroy cells that have really precious intracellular components. So stratified squamous for protection. If we look at simple cuboidal, they've got stuff. They're going to be producing things and releasing them, right? And they can also absorb things too. So areas of secretion, so simple, so we're going to look at simple cuboidal is often there. Simple cuboidal is often there for secretion and absorption. And the same thing happens with columnar epithelia. All right, so for example, the stomach. Simple cuboidal epithelia. All right, let's move on because I've already done videos on this. So that's going to be the epithelia, different types, form equals function. Let's now move on. So we've gone through those two tissue types, connective tissue and epithelial tissue. Told you we're going to go through nervous tissue and muscle tissue in the future, so no need to stress too much about that. What I want to talk about now is this week's stuff. So, integumentary. So we had a question about the integumentary system. So remember, with the integumentary system, you're going to have three major layers, right? Here are the three major layers of the integumentary system that you need to know. You're going to have the epithelial layer, called the epidermis, which means on dermis, which means this next layer is the dermal layer. And then this layer is called the hypodermis. These are the three layers of the skin. Epidermis, dermis, or dermal layer, and hypodermis. Let's write dermis for consistency. Epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. Now what you're talking about in the past sessions is that there's 5 layers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers here of the epidermis. All right, in the past we used to get students to know this. It's in your workbook, but it's there for completion's sake. You don't really need to know that. If you want to know it, here's a simple way. You say, come, let's get sunburnt. Come, let's get sunburnt. C-L-G-S-B. Right? Stratum corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basal layer. Don't stress. I'm not really going to assess you on that, so don't worry about it. Okay, but they're the 3 different layers of the skin. The top layer, so remember this, because this top layer is epithelial tissue, we just spoke about epithelia. It's stratified squamous, right? Now, epithelia has no blood supply. It has no nerve supply. It has none of that, which means you could put a needle in here and not feel it in the epidermal layer, right? However, there are some cells distributed through here that can lead to touch, pain, and all that type of stuff, but they reside here and they can project up. So you can have neurons that are residing in the dermal layer that move into the epidermal layer, and they're called Merkel cells. So Merkel cells you can find in the epidermal layer. There's other cells in the epidermal layer. The main cell type that makes up the epithelia are actually called keratinocytes or keratinocytes. So even though we're using all these different terms, right? Epidermis is made up of epithelia. The epithelial cells are called keratinocytes or keratinocytes. And it's only because cyte means cell, keratin just means protein. Remember how I said they're simple squamous? So you've got these simple squamous cells and it's just filled with a protein called keratin. That's why these epithelial cells are called keratinocytes. And they're there for protection. Now, what are the different cells that we've got in the epidermal layer? Merkel cells projecting up. We've got cells in here called melanocytes. These melanocytes release melanin that protect these cells from UV damage and causing skin cancer, right? That's what the melanocytes do. You've got other cells in here that have an immune function called Langerhans cells. Langerhans cells, they have an immune function. So you've got keratinocytes, Merkel cells, melanocytes, and Langerhans. They're the 4 main cell types inside the epidermal layer. Let's see if there's any questions. Do we need to know all the structures and components within the dermis layer? Well, what you need to know for the dermis layer, this layer here, is basically there's going to be connective tissue, blood vessels, nerve fibers. When we look at hair and nails, you can have aspects of hair and nail situated in there as well, and that's pretty much the detail you need for that. For tissues and what you are telling us now is what we need to know for this week's quiz. No, not necessarily, because I don't have time to go through all the content. We went through all the content in the lectures, so all the information you need is in the lectures. This tutorial is to give you a quick revision of some of the most important concepts. So before you do the online quiz this week, make sure you do watch the lecture, because the lecture will be able to cover 90% of everything. Obviously, there's other readings that need to be done, and that's can be located on your Learning at Griffith page under course content. All right, now let's move on to this week's content, which is skeletal system. And in the skeletal system, we're going to be looking at a couple of things, right? Within the skeletal system, we need to look at cartilage. So we need to look at bones, cartilage, and joints. So first thing I want to look at is bone. No, let's do cartilage first, right? All right, cartilage. We have cartilage distributed throughout our body. And what cartilage does is it resists compressive forces, impacts, and it allows to create smooth surfaces, frictionless surfaces for bones and structures to glide on. So for example, anytime you have one bone talking to another bone, so for example, anytime I have my radius or ulna talking to my humerus, anytime the bone comes together, there's going to be cartilage in between so that it's a frictionless surface or near frictionless surface. For example, when we look at our rib cage, parts of it is going to be cartilage. When we look at between my femur and my tibia, it's going to be cartilage. Cartilage is all over the place. Between my vertebrae, there's going to be cartilage. There's cartilage of the ear and the nose. It's all cartilage. But there's three major types of cartilage that you need to be aware of, right? There's hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. All right. When we have a look at hyaline cartilage, this is the most abundant. Hyaline cartilage you're going to find at articulating surfaces. So for example, like I said, when a bone comes in contact with another bone, what happens is this is where we have hyaline cartilage. Hopefully this is still running. All right, so we've got three different types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage. Hyaline is the most abundant. It is where you have one bone talking to another bone. Hyaline cartilage lines it. So what we say is when one bone articulates with another bone, that's called an articulating surface. So at articulating surfaces, that's where we find hyaline cartilage. So if you have a question in an exam about what type of cartilage would you find at the knee, what type of cartilage would you find between the ulna and the humerus, what type of cartilage would you find lining the ends of long bones, you're going to say hyaline cartilage. The rib cage, parts of it, hyaline cartilage, okay? Fibrocartilage. Now fibrocartilage is found in areas that need to resist compressive forces. Resists compressive forces. What does this mean? Right, think about this. Your vertebrae. You're going to have one vertebrae, another vertebrae, another vertebrae, another vertebrae, another vertebrae. Obviously, standing upright puts a lot of compressive force through your vertebral column. And if it was just bone on bone on bone on bone, it's going to be a lot of back issues. So you have cartilage in between. And this is fibrocartilage, but we call it our intervertebral discs. So your discs of your vertebrae is fibrocartilage. They resist compressive forces. You also have a little bit of fibrocartilage at your knee because there's some parts where there's going to be direct impact, not just articulating surfaces. Now the last one, elastic cartilage, is the least abundant. So it's elastic, so it's stretchy, it's bendable. You only find it in places where you can really stretch it and bendable, such as your ear. So ear and nose, ear, nose, and actually your epiglottis are the only places you're really going to find elastic cartilage. All right, so these are the main cartilage types. That's all good. Because cartilage is a connective tissue, right? It means it's made up of the three things. What are the three things that connective tissues are made up of? Cells, gels, and fibers. So as a quick example, cells are going to be chondro. That's the prefix we use, sites, meaning cells. The gels are pretty much the same types of gels you're going to see with bones and everything else, so don't stress. We'll just say with gels, they're what we call an extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix. It just means, it's a really fancy way of saying there's gels, jelly. Cells produce this extracellular matrix. So chondrocytes, more specifically a subset of chondrocytes, produces this extracellular matrix. I'm not going to ask about any specifics about extracellular matrix. The fibers that you're going to find for cartilage are going to be predominantly collagen fibers because it is quite tough, right? Quite tough. All right, let's now move on and have a look at bone. Bone is also connective tissue, as we're aware. So it's made up of cells, gels, and fibers. I'm going to draw up a long bone, and we're going to go through the structure of that long bone. Are we going with any questions? All right, if there's any questions, just let me know, not a problem. We're going to draw up a bone, type of bone that you're going to see on the Flintstones, for example. A bone that looks like that. Brilliant, that's a good bone. All right, what we're going to do, this is what we call a long bone. Why is it called a long bone? Simply because it is longer than it is wider. So any bone that you have in your body that is longer than it is wider is called a long bone. So the bones in your fingers, long bones. Forearm, so antebrachium, brachium, long bones. Legs, long bones, right? But there's different types of bones. You've got flat bones, such as the bones of your skull and sternum, for example. You've got irregular bones. Bones like your vertebrae, they're called irregular bones because they just have a strange shape, a shape that you don't see anywhere else. All right, a couple of things with a long bone. Let's look at the anatomy of a long bone. In your workbooks, which hopefully, so obviously this is your first online week for AMP. So we're ironing out all the creases here, but you know that I've created workbooks for you. So every week you'll have a different workbook. For weeks 1 to 4, because they were face-to-face, weeks 1 to 4, I've put them all in one workbook, but they're available under the tutorial folder. So access that anytime you want or not, it's entirely up to you. I've created a workbook for this week, which has fundamental questions, really easy questions to answer that you can basically get all the info from watching the lectures or YouTube videos, for example. Then you've got the applied section, and that's going to be more difficult, right? Now, in your workbook for this week, there's a picture of a long bone. Obviously, it looks better than this one, and it asks you to label it. So the different types of labeling that you can do for this long bone include, you probably have seen it looks like this. Label that part, label that part, label that part, and that part. All right. So what are we labeling? What is it called? All right, first thing is this. The shaft of the long bone is called the diaphysis. That's the shaft of the long bone. So the majority length of it, diaphysis. When we go to the very ends of the bone, you're going to have, this is called the epiphysis. And obviously you have two epiphyses. Epiphysis, epiphysis. Now, if I asked you a question, what is this area? And you say epiphysis, you may be correct. But there's two, and I need to know which is which, because obviously if we were to take my humerus, right, one end of the humerus is different to the other end of the humerus. Both have, there's an epiphysis up here and epiphysis down here, but they're different because one is closer to the site of attachment and the other one's further away from the site of attachment. So that should give you a hint as to how do we alter its name to reflect this. We can say, if this one up here, let's just say this long bone is my humerus and it attaches up at the glenohumeral joint, that's where it attaches up at the shoulder. This is what we call the proximal epiphysis. Therefore, this one is the distal epiphysis. So we've got the diaphysis, long bone, epiphysis, proximal, distal, depending on which one's the one closer to the site of attachment. Then we've got the metaphysis. And again, proximal metaphysis, distal metaphysis. And these are the majority of labeling that you need to do. However, there's some more. So for example, you may find that there's a region on the long bone up here, which I asked you to label, and this is called the epiphyseal line. the epiphyseal line, sometimes known as the epiphyseal plate, sometimes known as the growth plate. So, when newborns to infants are growing and developing, obviously they need to get taller. This happened a long time ago for me, but it's growing to, individuals grow taller, their bones lengthen because of the growth plate. This is where the cells, right, release the gels and the fibers to lengthen the bone. All right, so the growth plate. As you get older and you start to become an adult, it hardens and just becomes like other bony tissue, and you can see it, but it's called the epiphyseal line or the growth plate. All right, a couple other things that you need to label is you might find that there's a hollow inside of your long bone. The hollow inside of your long bone is called the medullary cavity. It's a cavity, it's empty. So there's actually a hollow inside to your long bones. Medulla means inside, right? So this is called the medullary cavity. All right, why is it hollow? Long bones are hollow because if they were filled with bone, your bones would be too heavy and dense and we wouldn't have enough muscles to be able to move and walk around. So it needs to be hollow. It also means bones can bend a little bit without snapping, which is very good. Inside that medullary cavity is bone marrow. All right, but there's two different types of bone marrow. We've got red bone marrow and we've got yellow bone marrow. Which type do we have in the medullary cavity of long bones? Well, if you are an adult, it's yellow bone marrow. If you are an infant, it's red bone marrow. I'll say that again. Hopefully I'm back. Froze a little bit, I'm sorry about that. When we look at the medullary cavity, which I drew up before, not sure where it froze, but we've got the hollow inside of the long bone, which is the medullary cavity. You've got two different types of bone marrow. If you are an adult, it's red bone marrow. If you are an infant, if you're an adult, it's yellow bone marrow. If you're an infant, it's red bone marrow. What's the difference? Red bone marrow creates red blood cells. Yellow bone marrow is just fat. And like I said, infants in their long bones, so their femur, their humerus, for example, will have red bone marrow creating red blood cells for them. Perfect. Adults will have yellow bone marrow, which is fat. So where do we create our red blood cells from? Well, in adults, it's in flat bones. So our skull, for example, and our sternum are places that we produce red blood cells from our red bone marrow. You may have heard of getting a needle into the hip and pulling out red bone marrow. That's because in our long bones, you've got two different types of bones. You've got bones that line the outside of the long bone, which is really hard, dense bone. This hard, dense bone is called cortical bone. In here, at the end, at the epiphysis, you've got what we call spongy bone. The spongy bone just looks spongy, but they're both as hard as one another. And inside the spongy bone, we have blood vessels and nerve fibers. Which means that when you break a bone, you do not have any blood vessels or nerve fibers in your cortical bone. It's hard and dense and you don't feel it. You will feel it when you break the skin, for example, because there's blood vessels there. But all of the damage can occur at the spongy bone. And this is where we've got red bone marrow in adults, for example. So if this is the femur, that's where we could get the red bone marrow out. All right, so this is the bone anatomy. When we look at give me 1 second. I'm just going to go plug or charge the iPad. Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry about that. Can everybody hear me and see me, please? Let me know. Okay, what is the hard outer layer called? Okay, can you just let me know in the chat? Okay, perfect. All right, so this hard outer layer of the bone is called cortical bone. Cortical bone. So there's two different types of bone when we look at a long bone, for example. The hard outer layer, called the cortical bone, it goes all the way around. Then you've got the spongy bone in the epiphyseal areas. And the spongy bone is still hard, but it's filled with blood vessels and nerve fibers. And this is one area that you can get bone marrow from, in this spongy bone. All right, let's see if there's any other questions. No, cool. All right, now I want to talk about the different types of cells for bones, because this is important. It's important because when we look at calcium homeostasis, so we're going to apply homeostasis in regards to bone structure, you need to know the different types of bone cells. So let's have a look at the different types. These are the types of bone cells you need to know. We've got, so firstly, the prefix is osteo. Remember I said chondro for cartilage? Osteo is for bone. So anytime you hear osteo, think bone, chondro, think cartilage. So osteo, progenitor cells, they're the first type you need to know. Second type is osteoblasts. Next type you need to know is osteoclasts. Then the last one is osteocytes. These are the 1, 2, 3, 4 types of bone cells you need to know. What is the periosteum? Okay, periosteum is just the outer layer of the bone. So the outer layer of the bone, known as the periosteum, is simply, you could peel it away, and underneath the it's going to be basically connective tissue, okay? But it's part of the bone. And if you were to peel that away, it would then be continuous with the cortical bone, or that hard bone, all right? All right. When we want to, so remember, every day your bone is breaking down and building up, breaking down and building up. This is why when astronauts go up into space, they come back and they've lost a significant amount of bone mass. They've lost heaps of bone mass. Why? Because they're not using bone. So when you jump and move and run, the impact on your bone stimulates it to make more bone. Make it harder, make it stronger. If you don't use it, it breaks it down. Bone is literally use it or lose it, all right? So, and it's because of these cell types. So this is how it basically works. Osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells. Now, what a stem cell does is it has the ability to create other cells. And the types of cells that osteoprogenitor cells produce are osteoblasts. So osteoprogenitor cells produce osteoblasts. Question now is, what are osteoblasts? Well, this is how I remember it. The B in blasts, think build. Osteoblasts build bone. Think of the B's. Osteoblasts build bone. They build bone. And the question is, how do they build bone? Well, bone is connective tissue, which means it's made up of cells, gels, and fibers, right? In this case, the cells we're referring to are osteoblasts. And what the osteoblasts do is they secrete the gels, they secrete the fibers, and they take in calcium and phosphate from the blood to make the bone really hard and dense. So this is how I think about it. If I was an osteoblast, right, I basically am laying down all these laying down all these fibers and gels around me. Then I pull in calcium and phosphate and embed it in. So the calcium and phosphate is like the concrete, right? And I've got the bricks here, and the bricks are going to be different densities of gels and fibers mixed together, right? It's like a hard jelly. So put it in, put it in, put it in. What happens is, over time, this osteoblast is building bone around itself, and then it gets stuck in the bone. The osteoblast is now stuck. What osteoblasts turn into, once they've built bone, is osteocytes. So cyte means cell. It's a mature osteoblast. An osteocyte is a mature osteoblast. And as mature cells, like mature people do, they stand around and they look and they judge and they evaluate what should be going on. Because they're stuck in that tissue, they go, does the things need to be built up even more or broken down even more? And that's what it thinks about. That's what these osteocytes do. They evaluate. Now, the only type we haven't spoken about is the osteoclasts. Now, I think of the C in clasts as crushing. They crush bone. Now, they don't actually crush bone. They break it down. But think of the C as crush bone. So osteoblasts build bone, osteoclasts crush or break down bone. Now think about this, right? You now know that bone is made up of cells, gels, fibers, calcium, and phosphate, right? And they're all embedded in because of the osteoblasts. But if I want to break bone down and stimulate the osteoclasts, what's going to be released from bone? Well, the cells will be, the gels will be, the fibers will be, but also the calcium and phosphate. So this is an important point. Bones are one of the primary pools or resources for calcium and phosphate. Calcium, really, really important. Calcium does a couple of things in the body. It does many things. One of the things calcium does is it allows for your muscles to contract. That's really important. Another important thing that calcium does is allows for your neurons to send signals. Two really important things here. So if we don't have enough calcium, where can we get it from? We can pull it from the bone. How? We need to stimulate the osteoclasts. So this now leads us on to calcium homeostasis. So let's take a look. Let's see if there's any questions so far. Okay, cool. Is everything making sense? Do you have any questions? Hopefully everything's making sense. This is a really quick summary of obviously the lectures and the YouTube videos and so forth. I thought I'd go through some of the main points. Obviously it's not everything, but it's some of the most important points. All right, let's now look at calcium homeostasis, because we now have set the scene. Calcium's important because that's for muscles to contract and allows for neurons to send signals, among other things. So what happens if our blood calcium goes too low? Let's have a look. If we have a drop in blood calcium, what happens? Well, we know homeostasis, right? Homeostasis has positive and negative feedback. If it's negative feedback, the outcome does the opposite of the stimulus. So if this is negative feedback, the outcome will end up being an increase in blood calcium. If this is positive feedback, the outcome exacerbates the stimulus, which means the outcome of calcium homeostasis could be it further drops calcium. Now that's obviously not what we want. If the stimulus or trigger is a drop in blood calcium, it's going too low, we need to bring it back up. So it's going to be negative feedback. Calcium homeostasis is a form of negative feedback. Now, do we have a question? Can you tell me the function of osteocytes again? Yes, I'll tell you in this concept because this will really be helpful. All right, you ready? So, blood calcium drops too low. What happens? Well, this is the stimulus. Remember, all homeostasis has the same components. That's the stimulus. This stimulus will be picked up by receptors on a particular organ. Now, or gland. This particular organ or gland is called the parathyroid gland. If you were to take your trachea, all right, hugging the front of your trachea is a butterfly-shaped gland called the thyroid. If I were to turn you around, your thyroid, which hugs your trachea, hugs around the back. Now, if we were to have a look at the back of the thyroid, there's some glands embedded into it. These are called parathyroid glands. So let's draw the trachea from the back, and you're going to have the thyroid gland like that, hugging it like that. So around the front, fully wrapped around, and here we have from the back, so it's a posterior view of the thyroid gland and the trachea embedded in it, parathyroid glands. Yeah, between 4 to 8 parathyroid glands. Parathyroid glands. So they're going to pick up the stimulus. So they have receptors. Pick up the stimulus, drop in blood calcium. What do the parathyroid glands do? They release a hormone. That hormone is parathyroid hormone. This is simple. Parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. Let's just say PTH. All right, let's leave PTH there for a second. Let's draw it down here. PTH. All right, let's leave parathyroid hormone for a second, because something else is happening at the same time. So the sun is dropping UV rays onto you. These UV rays hit your skin. Now, UV rays, when they hit your skin, produces a vitamin D precursor. It's got a long name, you don't need to know it, so you can just say vitamin D precursor. So there's a vitamin D precursor that's made. Now, this vitamin D precursor goes to your liver. And your liver turns it into calcidiol. Calcidiol goes to your kidneys. And your kidneys turn it into calcitriol. Now that's confusing. Calcidiol, calcitriol. Liver turns it into the vitamin D precursor into calcidiol. Kidneys turn calcidiol into calcitriol. How do you remember this? Well, remember, calcidiol, D comes before T in the alphabet. So that's how I remember calcidiol over calcitriol. Now, this is where it gets important. Both PTH and calcitriol work together. So the vitamin D that's ultimately been made in the form of calcitriol and parathyroid hormone come together to do three things to try and increase our blood calcium. What are the three things? 1, increase calcium absorption. And the question is, absorption where? We're talking about the gut, right? We're talking about the small intestines. We want to increase how much calcium we absorb through our gut into our blood. If we do that, blood calcium levels go up. Great. Negative feedback, the opposite of what the stimulus was. The second thing that both parathyroid hormone and calcitriol do together is it decreases calcium excretion from the kidneys. So remember, your kidneys pee things out, right? We stop it from peeing out calcium, which means it stays in the blood. And again, we increase blood calcium. Perfect. And the third thing that it does is it stimulates, you probably can think of this from what we said before, stimulates osteocytes. And this is what someone asked before. What do osteocytes do? Osteoclasts. What do osteoclasts do? They break down bone. Remember, the C stands for crush. Osteoclasts crush bone. And if bone's filled with calcium, it releases that calcium into the blood, increasing blood calcium. This is calcium homeostasis. I've done a YouTube video on it and it's in the online lecture. Broke out at, but I hope that we're talking about calcitriol. So when we look at calcitriol with PTH working together, increased calcium absorption, decreased calcium excretion, stimulates osteoclasts, releasing calcium. Perfect. If we increase blood calcium, what's going to happen in this scenario? I'll just double check that everyone's okay. All right. So, when we look at the opposite, so what happens when you increase blood calcium? Blood calcium increases don't go to the parathyroid glands, they go to the thyroid. And obviously, they don't release parathyroid hormone, they release calcitonin. What calcitonin does is it increases calcium excretion and inhibits osteoclasts. Doing both of those things drops blood calcium back down again. Let me show you what I mean. If we were to just summarize calcium homeostasis, if we were to summarize calcium homeostasis, this is how I would summarize it. If there is a drop, in blood calcium, this then stimulates the parathyroid gland. This releases parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone with calcitriol increases calcium absorption, decreases calcium excretion, and stimulates osteoclasts. These are the three things that this does. Increasing calcium absorption increases blood calcium. Perfect. Decreasing calcium excretion increases blood calcium. Perfect. Stimulating osteoclasts mean bones are crushed and broken down, releasing calcium into the blood. Perfect. But what happens if your blood calcium increases? So you have an increase in blood calcium. Well, this stimulates not the parathyroid gland, but the thyroid gland, which stimulates calcitonin. And calcitonin increases calcium excretion, so we pee out more calcium, and inhibits osteoclasts. We don't want to break bone down. We want to keep the calcium in there, but stimulates osteoblasts to build bone up. So hopefully that makes sense. This is calcium homeostasis. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Apart from that, the last thing I want to talk about is the synovial joints. And the synovial joints are a little bit easier to talk about because there's many different joints in the body, right? Synovial joints are definitely the most abundant joint. Synovial joints, if you watch the video, there's 6 different types of synovial joints, right? Don't stress out about knowing their names and where you can find them. The most important synovial joint I want you to know is the ball and socket joint. That's the most movable joint. The ball and socket joint is here at the shoulder and here at the hip. Now I want you to think about this. All synovial joints have things in common. They have a bone articulating in at another bone. Now, a ball and socket's going to look a little bit like this. They both have a membrane around it and a thicker tendon around it. Tendinous sheath or a tendinous membrane. Now, what synovial joints always have is a fluid in between called a synovial fluid. Synovial fluid. And the membrane that releases the fluid is called the synovial membrane. The question is, why do we have synovial fluid? Well, the fluid reduces the friction because at ball and socket joints, the head of this bone is going to be articulating in with the surface. Now, I said the bones are articulating with one another, which means there must be cartilage lining their surfaces. And there is. What type of cartilage did I say lines articulating surfaces? Do you remember? That's hyaline cartilage. So you've got hyaline cartilage lining those two surfaces. So this is what's in common with synovial joints, all right? And I said there's 6 different types. Don't stress too much about them. But when it comes to ball and socket joints, let's just look at the difference between the shoulder joint and the hip joint. What's important to know? This. When we look at the shoulder joint, and let's compare it to the hip.